There are names that still echo through history, not just as footnotes, but as thunderclaps, legends carved into the annals of time with the edge of an axe and the roar of a war cry. Picture this, a lone longship cutting through the mist, its dragon-headed prow a warning to all who see it. The men who commanded these ships weren't just warriors, they were forces of nature, leaders who bent kingdoms to their will through sheer might and cunning. Today, we step into the shadow of the 20 most feared Viking chieftains, the ones who didn't just raid coasts but rewrote the maps of Europe with fire and iron. These were rulers who knew no mercy, whose reputations alone could empty villages before a single sword was drawn. But behind the tales of bloodshed lies something deeper: strategy, ambition, and a relentless drive to leave a legacy that would outlast them. From the icy fjords of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of medieval Europe, their influence stretched farther than their longships could sail. So ready yourself for a journey into the heart of the Viking Age, where power wasn't just taken, it was forged in battle and held with an iron grip. The stories of these chieftains aren't just about fear, they're about what happens when ambition meets utter ruthlessness. And trust me, by the end, you'll understand why their names still send shivers down spines centuries later. Ragnar Lothbrok's name alone was enough to make kings tremble. Whether he was one man or many, the stories woven around him paint the portrait of a warrior who defied emperors and humbled nations. The sagas tell of his audacious raid on Paris in the year 845, where he allegedly spared the city only after its ruler paid him a fortune in silver and gold. But it wasn't just wealth he sought, it was reputation. Ragnar understood the power of fear as a weapon, and he wielded it masterfully. His infamous execution in King Aila's snake pit, if the tales are true, became the spark that ignited his son's wrath. Ivar the Boneless, Bjorn Ironside, and their brothers didn't just seek vengeance. They launched the great Heathen army, a force so brutal it reshaped England forever. What's fascinating is how Ragnar's legend grew larger than life. Some historians argue he was a composite of several raiders, a symbol of Viking ambition itself. Yet, even if the details blur, one truth remains: his name became synonymous with the unstoppable force of the North. Churches across Europe prayed for deliverance from his shadow, and to this day, his story captures that quintessential Viking spirit: unyielding, unpredictable, and utterly unforgettable. If Ragnar Lothbrok was the thunder, his son Ivar the Boneless was the lightning, swift, unpredictable, and devastating. Unlike the hulking warriors of legend, Ivar's strength wasn't in his arms but in his mind. Some sagas claim his nickname came from a serpent-like ability to twist and strike in battle, while others whisper of brittle bones that left him carried on a shield. Yet neither theory explains the terror he inspired. This was a man who didn't just fight battles, he orchestrated them like a grand, bloody symphony. Take the Siege of York in the year 867. While other Vikings charged blindly, Ivar lured the Northumbrian king into a trap, feigning retreat only to slaughter the enemy army in the city's narrow streets. But his true weapon was fear. After capturing King Edmund of East Anglia, he didn't just kill him, he turned the execution into a spectacle, binding the king to a tree and riddling him with arrows until he resembled a human hedgehog, as the chronicles grimly describe. Even his death was calculated. According to legend, he ordered himself buried in a mound piled high with the corpses of his enemies, ensuring his presence would haunt the land long after he was gone. What made Ivar extraordinary wasn't just his brutality, but his understanding of power. He knew that to rule, you didn't just need an army, you needed people to believe resistance was futile. And for decades, England believed. While Ivar the Boneless ruled through terror and tactics, his brother Bjorn Ironside embodied something far more dangerous: reckless ambition with the strength to back it up. Where most Vikings stuck to familiar coasts, Bjorn dreamed beyond the horizon, turning the Mediterranean into his personal hunting ground. Picture this, a fleet of longships never before seen in those turquoise waters, appearing like ghosts off the Italian coast. Towns that had weathered Roman legions and Moorish fleets now faced a new nightmare Northmen who fought like demons and vanished before armies could rally. His most infamous stunt, the sack of Luna in the year 860, convinced he'd reached Rome itself, Bjorn allegedly faked his own death to breach the city's walls, his warriors carrying his corpse in a Christian burial procession only to spring from the coffin swords drawn. Whether the tale is true or not, it captures the essence of the man, a mix of brute force and theatrical cunning, but his real genius lay in adaptation. In North Africa, he traded his longships for camels, leading raids deep into the desert. In Iberia, he outmaneuvered the Umayyad navy by launching flaming decoy ships, a tactic so effective it became legendary. What set Bjorn apart wasn't just his relentless raids, but his refusal to accept limits. While other chieftains measured wealth in silver, he measured it in the shock on a Byzantine emperor's face when Norse sails appeared where no Viking should dare to sail. Even after retiring to rule Sweden, his name kept Mediterranean mothers warning their children about the Iron Bear from the north. Because Bjorn Ironside didn't just raid, he rewrote the rules of what a Viking could be. Erik Bloodaxe didn't just earn his name, he baptized himself in it. While other Viking rulers balanced brutality with diplomacy, Erik embraced slaughter as both strategy and sport. Born into Norwegian royalty, he could have ruled through lineage alone, but power wasn't something he inherited, it was something he carved from the bones of his own family. The sagas whisper of 5 brothers, each a potential rival, each meeting a grim end by Erik's hand. Some say he wielded his axe so often that its blade never dried, a grisly testament to his ruthlessness. Exiled from Norway for his atrocities, he didn't flee in shame. He set his sights on a new kingdom, Northumbria. York, with its crumbling Roman walls and fracturing alliances, became the perfect stage for his reign of terror. Here, Erik didn't just collect taxes, he extorted them with flames and steel, turning prosperous towns into smoldering warnings. His rule was a masterclass in fear. Local nobles either bowed or vanished, their bodies left as reminders of the cost of defiance. But what's chilling isn't just the violence, it's the way he seemed to savor it. Poets of the time wrote of his laughter echoing over battlefields, his axe singing as it split shields and skulls alike. Even his allies feared him. The moment his grip weakened, they turned on him, cutting him down in an ambush near Stainmore. Yet in death, Erik achieved a kind of dark immortality. His name became shorthand for savagery, a legend so potent that centuries later, medieval chroniclers still recounted his deeds with a mix of horror and perverse admiration. Because Erik Bloodaxe proved one thing: in the Viking Age, mercy was weakness and terror. Well, terror built empires. Now, contrast that with a chieftain who understood that true power wasn't just in the blade, but in the minds of those who feared it. Enter Harald Hardrada, the last great Viking king, a man whose life reads like an epic poem. An exiled prince turned Byzantine mercenary, he returned to Scandinavia not just with wealth, but with tactics honed in the fires of empire. While Erik ruled through raw fury, Harald wielded intimidation like a surgeon's knife. His invasion of England in the year 1066 wasn't just a raid, it was a psychological onslaught. Before his ships even landed, rumors of his exploits had already frayed the nerves of the English defenders. At Stamford Bridge, his final stand, he didn't just fight. He staged his own death as a Viking king should, standing firm atop a mountain of corpses, his final words a challenge to fate itself. Harald's genius lay in knowing that legacy wasn't just carved in blood, but in the stories people told long after the battles ended. And in that, he outmaneuvered even Erik Bloodaxe, because while Erik made men fear the man, Harald made them fear the myth. Harald Hardrada wasn't just a king, he was a force of nature, a man whose life seemed ripped from the pages of an epic poem. Imagine a teenager forced into exile after his half-brother's death, not cowering in some foreign court, but rising through the ranks of the Byzantine Empire's elite Varangian guard. While other Vikings raided coastal villages, Harald was fighting in Sicily, Bulgaria, and even the Holy Land, amassing wealth and tactics that would make him unstoppable. By the time he returned to Norway, he wasn't just a warrior, he was a warlord forged in the fires of empire, and he took his throne not through inheritance but by crushing anyone who stood in his way. His ambitions stretched far beyond Norway's fjords. When he set his sights on England in the year 1066, it wasn't just another raid, it was the culmination of a lifetime of conquest. He landed with an army so fearsome that locals whispered he'd come to claim what was rightfully his, a kingdom once ruled by Viking lords. But what made Harald terrifying wasn't just his military might, it was his timing. He arrived just as England was already bracing for another invasion, splitting its defenses and nearly rewriting history. At Stamford Bridge, facing impossible odds, he didn't plead or retreat. He fought like a man who knew his name would echo through the ages, standing tall until an arrow found its mark. In that moment, the Viking age didn't just fade, it died with him, sword in hand. Yet, even in defeat, Harald achieved what so few warriors ever do, immortality. Because legends aren't just about victories, they're about the audacity to challenge fate itself. Here was a man who understood that terror alone wouldn't secure a legacy. Timing, strategy, and sheer audacity could topple kingdoms. While other chieftains burned villages, Harald studied empires. His time in Constantinople taught him more than combat. It taught him how power truly worked. He didn't just want to rule, he wanted to eclipse every king who came before him. That's why his invasion of England wasn't just a gamble, it was a masterpiece of ambition. He knew the English throne was weakened, divided, and ripe for the taking. And had fate twisted just slightly, London might have spoken Norse instead of French after 1066. But perhaps what's most fascinating about Harald isn't his near success, it's how he defied the very idea of an ending. Even in death, he forced history to remember him not as a footnote, but as the last true Viking king, a storm that refused to fade quietly. Centuries later, his name still resonates, not just as a warning, but as a reminder that some men don't just live history, they bend it to their will. Swain Forkbeard didn't just bring fire and steel to England, he rewrote its destiny. While other Viking leaders were content with plunder, Swain played the long game, turning seasonal raids into a full-scale conquest. It began with calculated brutality, like the St. Bryce's Day massacre in the year 1002. Saxon chronicles describe how King Ethelred ordered the killing of all Danes in England, a desperate move that backfired spectacularly. Swain seized the moment, casting himself not as a raider but as an avenger, rallying Norse settlers and warriors under his banner. His genius lay in exploiting divisions, pitting Anglo-Saxon nobles against each other while his fleet circled like wolves. Town after town fell, not just to axes but to terror. Rumors of his approach emptied entire regions before a single sword was drawn. By 1013, London itself surrendered, its gates opened not by siege engines but by sheer exhaustion. For a fleeting moment, Swain sat on the English throne, the first Viking king to claim it outright. Yet his reign lasted mere weeks before his sudden death, a twist of fate that spared England decades of Norse rule, but not for long. His son Cnut would return to finish what Swain started, proving that even in death, the Forkbeard's ambition was unstoppable. What set Swain apart wasn't just his military prowess, but his understanding of power's theater. He knew victory wasn't just about battles, it was about making an entire people believe resistance was impossible. And for a time, England believed. Olaf Trigvasen was a storm that changed direction mid-tempest, a raider turned zealot, a slaver turned saint-maker. His life reads like a saga where the hero and villain share the same face. Born into exile, he spent his early years as a mercenary, carving a name for himself across the Baltic and beyond. The same hands that once gripped slave chains would later clutch a crucifix with equal fervor. His conversion wasn't quiet or personal, it was a wildfire. After being baptized in England, he returned to Norway not with open palms but with a sword in one hand and a Bible in the other. Picture this, longships laden not with plunder but with priests, their mission not trade but total transformation. Olaf didn't persuade, he purged. Pagan temples burned while their keepers faced an impossible choice, convert or die. At Trondheim, he gathered chieftains for a grim showcase, smashing idols of Thor and Odin before their eyes, daring them to protest. Yet for all his brutality, there was cunning beneath the cruelty. He knew Norway would never unite under warring gods, so he gave them one, by force if necessary. His reign was short but seismic, setting the stage for a Christian kingdom that would outlast him. Even his death was a spectacle. Cornered at sea by enemies he'd made on both sides of the faith, he chose the Viking way, leaping from his ship in full armor rather than surrender, vanishing into the waves like a martyr mid-prayer. Historians still debate whether Olaf was a true believer or a tyrant using faith as a tool. But one thing's certain, he didn't just change Norway's religion. He shattered its old world with the same fury he'd once used to defend it. A conqueror to the last, proving that even salvation can come edged in steel. Sigurd's snake in the eye didn't just inherit his father's legacy, he wore it like a living omen. That serpentine mark in his eye, whether birthright or battle scar, became more than a curiosity. It was a symbol, a whisper of destiny that followed him like a shadow. Where his brothers relied on brute force or cunning, Sigurd wielded something subtler, an aura of inevitability. Even his name wasn't just a label, it was a story in itself, one that made enemies hesitate. Imagine facing a man whose very gaze seemed to promise either victory or doom. His rise in Denmark wasn't just about conquest, it was a masterclass in balance. While other chieftains burned bridges, Sigurd built them, weaving alliances with the same precision he used to plan raids. But don't mistake diplomacy for weakness. When crossed, he struck with chilling efficiency, his campaigns unfolding like a prophecy fulfilled. Take his raids along the Frankish coast, town after town fell not to chaos, but to something far more unsettling, flawless execution, as if the outcomes had been written long before the first arrow flew. And then there was the sword, whispered to be cursed. Its blade allegedly carried a hunger no sheath could contain, a relic that chose its wielder as much as the other way around. Whether myth or not, the tales clung to him, amplifying his reputation. While history remembers his brothers in louder detail, Sigurd's influence lingered in the quiet ways, the treaties that held, the borders that shifted without bloodshed, and the dread that settled over Europe whenever his serpent-marked banner appeared on the horizon. Because in the end, the most feared rulers aren't always the loudest. Sometimes they're the ones who make silence feel like a storm about to break. Halfdan Ragnarsson was the quiet storm of the great heathen army. Where others roared, he simply raised. While his brothers Ivar and Ub carved their names into history with spectacle, Halfdan operated in the shadows, a strategist who understood that wars were won not by the loudest axe but by the sharpest mind. Take the Battle of Ashdown in the year 871. While King Ethelred's Saxons knelt in prayer, Halfdan seized the moment, reorganizing his forces mid-chaos to strike where the enemy least expected. His genius wasn't in brute force, it was in reading the field like a chessboard. turning retreats into traps and fatigue into opportunity. By the time the Saxons lifted their heads from prayer, Viking banners already fluttered where their flank had been. Yet what made Halfdan truly formidable was his restraint. Unlike Erik Bloodaxe's theatrics or Sigurd's mystique, Halfdan's power lay in his predictability, steady, ruthless, and utterly inevitable. When the heathen army fractured after Ivar's disappearance, it was Halfdan who held the remnants together, securing Northumbria not through flashy sieges but through sheer, grinding persistence. His rule was a masterclass in silent control. Norse settlers flourished under his governance, while Saxon lords learned the hard way that his quiet demeanor masked an iron will. Even his death defied expectation. Vanishing into the Irish mists during a raid, his fate remains one of history's unsolved riddles. Some say he fell in battle, others claim he simply walked away, his work done. But perhaps that's the point. Halfdan didn't need a dramatic end. His legacy was written in the land itself, in the fortresses that stood and the kingdoms that bowed. Because while flamboyant warlords burned bright and fast, he proved something far more terrifying. That patience in the right hands could conquer just as completely as fire. Guthrum wasn't just another raider, he was the shadow that nearly swallowed England whole. While other Viking warlords chased fleeting glory, he played a longer game, targeting the very heart of Anglo-Saxon resistance, Alfred's Wessex. Their struggle wasn't just battles, it was a clash of wits, with Guthrum perfecting the art of vanishing warfare. He'd strike like lightning, burning towns, ambushing supply lines, then dissolve into the marshes before Alfred's forces could retaliate. The winter of 878 became his masterpiece. While the Saxons hunkered down, Guthrum launched a surprise attack so devastating it forced Alfred into hiding, a fugitive in his own kingdom. For months, it seemed England's fate was sealed until Alfred's legendary comeback at Edington. But here's where Guthrum revealed his true genius. Defeated but not broken, he didn't flee or resist. He knelt for baptism, taking the Christian name Athelstan and transforming from pagan scourge to legitimate ruler overnight. Some saw surrender, Guthrum saw opportunity. East Anglia became his Chinese letter, where he ruled not as a foreign invader but as a king recognized by Rome itself. Norse laws mixed with Saxon customs, trade flourished under his protection, and Viking settlers found stability without shedding their identity. Guthrum's real legacy wasn't the terror he'd wrought, it was proving that the fiercest warriors could also be the shrewdest statesmen. He didn't just bend the knee to Alfred, he bent history itself, showing that sometimes the deadliest weapon wasn't an axe, it was adaptability. Rollo wasn't just a Viking, he was a seismic force, a man so colossal that chroniclers swore no horse could bear his weight. Whether that was literal or a metaphor for his ambition, one thing's certain: when he sailed up the Seine in the year 911, Paris held its breath. His siege wasn't just another raid, it was a spectacle of psychological warfare. While other chieftains burned villages and fled, Rollo settled in like a storm cloud, choking the city's lifelines until the Frankish king had no choice but to negotiate. The Treaty of St. Clair-sur-Epte wasn't just a payout, it was a kingdom handed over in exchange for peace, a strip of land that would become Normandy. But here's where Rollo defied expectations. Instead of pillaging his new territory, he planted roots, marrying into Frankish nobility and adopting Christianity not out of piety but pragmatism. His genius lay in understanding that real power wasn't just taken, it was legitimized. Norse settlers flocked to his lands, blending their traditions with Frankish law to create something entirely new, a Viking society in a feudal world. And then there's the irony. The man who once terrified Europe became its shield, defending the Seine from other raiders as part of his bargain. His descendants would go even further, culminating in William the Conqueror, who'd take Rollo's legacy across the Channel to reshape England forever. Rollo's story isn't just about violence, it's about reinvention. He proved that even the most ruthless raider could become a kingmaker, so long as he knew when to trade his axe for a crown. Egil Skallagrimsson was a tempest in human form, a man who wielded poetry like a second axe, each verse as sharp as the blade that carved his enemies. Where other Vikings channeled fury into sheer brutality, Egil sculpted his rage into art, making him one of history's most unsettling contradictions. Picture this, a hulking berserker with a forehead so thick it deflected swords, yet capable of spinning words so exquisite they moved kings to spare his life, or so the sagas claim. His feud with Erik Bloodaxe wasn't just a clash of steel, it was a battle of wits and words. After slaughtering one of the king's retainers, Egil didn't flee or beg for mercy. He marched into Erik's own hall and delivered a poem so devastatingly flattering, a head ransom verse, that the Bloodaxe himself, a man who rarely hesitated to execute, let him walk free. That was Egil's power. He didn't just break rules, he bent reality, turning certain death into a performance where even his enemies became captive audience members. But for every stanza he composed, there was a matching act of savagery. When his brother's murderer sought refuge in a temple, Egil didn't respect sanctuary. He butchered the man on sacred ground, then taunted the gods by impaling a horse's head on a stake as a curse. His moods shifted like winter storms, one moment composing elegies for a dead son, the next drowning his sorrow in bloodshed. And that's what made him truly terrifying, not his strength or skill, but his unpredictability. Kings could negotiate with raiders, bribe warlords, or outmaneuver politicians. But how do you reason with a man who might recite a sonnet or split your skull based on the tilt of his brow? Even in old age, he defied expectations. Blind and frail, he supposedly buried his silver near a riverbank, then murdered the slave who helped him to keep the location secret, only to forget the spot himself, leaving the treasure lost for eternity. It's the perfect metaphor for Egil, a man who hoarded glory and chaos in equal measure, then took the full measure of both to his grave. His saga isn't just a chronicle of violence, it's a mirror held up to the Viking soul, reflecting the duality that made them so formidable and so impossible to tame. Because Egil Skallagrimsson didn't just live between extremes, he proved they could coexist in one man, leaving behind a legacy as unsettling as it was unforgettable. A poet who made corpses, a monster who wept for beauty, that was the enigma no saga could fully unravel. Thorkel the Tall stood as a living contradiction, a man whose loyalty could be bought but whose word, once given, became ironclad. Towering over his contemporaries both physically and strategically, he didn't just join battles, he orchestrated them with the precision of a chess master. Most Vikings fought for plunder or glory. Thorkel fought for something far more calculated: opportunity. His early career reads like a ledger of shifting allegiances, first ravaging England with Swain Forkbeard's Danes, then abruptly switching sides to defend the same lands he'd burned. Why? Because King Ethelred offered him something sweeter than gold: legitimacy. In the year 1012, he became the English king's hired blade, commanding a fleet so formidable it was dubbed the Thingolith, a brotherhood of mercenaries bound not by blood but by shared greed and discipline. But Thorkel's true genius lay in timing. When Ethelred's paranoia led to the massacre of Danish settlers, including Thorkel's own kin, he didn't just seek vengeance. He bided his time, waiting until Wessex was weakest before defecting back to the Danes, now led by Swain's son Nut. The moment he landed on English shores again, entire regions surrendered without a fight, not because they feared his army, but because they knew his reputation. This was a warlord who turned betrayal into an art form, each switch of allegiance amplifying his power. Yet for all his ruthlessness, Thorkel understood the limits of chaos. After helping Swein secure the English throne, he didn't vanish into obscurity like other mercenaries. He became the king's right hand, governing vast territories with surprising efficiency. The same man who once burned monasteries now enforced laws protecting them not out of piety, but because stability served his interests. Even his height played into the legend. Sagas claim he could cleave a horse in two with a single stroke, a towering symbol of authority no one dared challenge. In the end, Thorkel the Tall proved that the deadliest Vikings weren't always the ones who screamed loudest on the battlefield. Sometimes they were the ones who knew when to kneel and when to rise with a dagger in hand. His legacy wasn't carved in stone or sung in sagas. It was written in the silent spaces between oaths where real power thrived. Haystein didn't just raid cities, he rewrote the rules of war with pure, unadulterated trickery. While other Vikings relied on brute force, he orchestrated chaos like a puppeteer, pulling strings no one else could even see. Take the infamous sack of Luna in the year 860. Most raiders would have stormed the gates. Haystein staged an elaborate funeral. Convinced the Italian town was Rome itself, he had his men carry his lifeless body through the gates, pleading for a Christian burial. The moment the grieving citizens lowered their guard, the corpse sprang from his coffin, axe in hand, unleashing hell from within. It was more than a raid, it was theater, a psychological masterstroke that left enemies questioning reality itself. But Luna was just the beginning. In North Africa, he disguised his longships as merchant vessels, slipping past defenses before torching entire ports. Along the Loire, he spread rumors of a cursed Viking fleet, sowing panic so potent that towns surrendered without a fight. Haystein understood something his peers often missed. Fear moved faster than swords, and a well-crafted lie could topple walls no battering ram could breach. His campaigns stretched from France's heartland to the deserts of Mauritania, each marked by a signature blend of audacity and wit. When confronted by superior forces, he didn't retreat, he pretended to flee, luring pursuers into ambushes where the terrain became his silent ally. What's fascinating isn't just his success, but his restraint. Unlike Erik Bloodaxe or Ivar the Boneless, Haystein rarely left mountains of corpses in his wake. He preferred chaos over carnage, knowing a destabilized enemy was far more useful than a dead one. Even in defeat, he turned the tables. Captured by Frankish forces, he allegedly converted to Christianity to secure his release, only to shrug off the baptism the moment his chains were gone, laughing at the fools who'd believed him. Haystein's legacy isn't carved in stone or sung in sagas. It's etched into the annals of military strategy, a testament to the power of deception. In an age defined by brute strength, he proved the sharpest weapon wasn't always steel. Sometimes it was the willingness to make your enemies doubt their own eyes. And for those who faced him, that was far more terrifying than any axe. Ketil Flatnose didn't just conquer territory. He carved a kingdom from the chaos of the Scottish Isles, thumbing his nose at kings and conventions alike. While other Vikings bowed to Harald Fairhair's unification of Norway, Ketil stood apart, his defiance as rugged as the windswept cliffs of his adopted homeland. That infamous nickname, some say it came from a brutal clash that left his face forever marked. But those who crossed him knew the true source of his power wasn't in his appearance, it was in his refusal to kneel. The Hebrides became his stage, a patchwork of Norse and Celtic cultures where he ruled not by birthright but by sheer force of will. What set Ketil apart wasn't just his resistance to Harald's rule, it was his strategic cunning. He didn't just raid the Isles, he embedded himself in them, marrying into local dynasties and turning former enemies into loyal followers. While Harald's enforcers chased him across the North Atlantic, Ketil turned the islands into a fortress, his knowledge of the treacherous tides and hidden coves making him nearly untouchable. And when the pressure grew too great, he didn't surrender, he pivoted, sending his descendants westward to Iceland. where they'd plant the seeds of a new Norse society far from any king's reach. Ketil's legacy wasn't built on epic battles or vast wealth. It was forged in the quiet defiance of those who'd rather die free than live under another's boot. His story echoes in the sagas of Iceland's settlers, a reminder that sometimes the most feared Vikings weren't the ones who ruled empires, but the ones who refused to be ruled at all. The deep-minded shattered expectations in an age when Viking legends were written in men's blood. While chieftains like Erik Bloodaxe carved their names with brutality, wielded something far more subtle and perhaps more terrifying, an unbreakable will forged in loss. When her husband, the Norse king of Dublin, fell in battle, she didn't retreat to the shadows. She commandeered an entire longship, filling it not just with her family, but with their future. Picture this, a woman steering through the North Atlantic's fury, past Orkney's political quagmire toward Iceland's uncharted shores, all while outmaneuvering every man who doubted her. What made Aud extraordinary wasn't just her journey, but her foresight. She didn't just claim land in Iceland, she orchestrated its cultivation, distributing plots to her followers with the precision of a general deploying troops. Local sagas still whisper of her arrival, how she tossed her high-seat pillars into the waves, vowing to settle where the gods washed them ashore, a divine endorsement no warrior dared challenge. But her true power lay in diplomacy. While male chieftains clashed over petty feuds, Aud brokered alliances, marrying her grandchildren into influential families until her web of influence stretched across the island. Even her nickname, Deep-Minded, speaks volumes, not deep-voiced or iron-fisted, but a recognition of the intellect that made kings listen. In a world where most women's stories were erased, Aud didn't just survive history, she rewrote it, proving that leadership wasn't about gender but grit. And centuries later, her descendants would still rule Iceland, a testament to the quiet storm that was Aud, a woman who didn't need an axe to bend the world to her will. Olaf the White wasn't just a ruler of Dublin, he was the architect of its golden age, a chieftain who turned a ragtag Viking settlement into the beating heart of Norse power in Ireland. While other warlords burned and fled, Olaf built, forging a kingdom that thrived on both blade and bargain. His rise was anything but ordinary. Born into Norwegian nobility, he didn't just sail to Ireland, he conquered it piece by piece, marrying into Gaelic royalty to cement his authority. Dublin under Olaf wasn't just a raider's den. It became a bustling hub of trade and terror, where merchants haggled over silk and slaves while longships patrolled the Irish Sea like wolves guarding their territory. What set Olaf apart was his mastery of the double-edged sword diplomacy, as sharp as his axe. When he wasn't leading brutal raids on Wales or Francia, he was brokering alliances with Irish kings, playing clans against each other with the finesse of a chess grandmaster. Take his infamous pact with Surbal, the Irish king of Osrage. One season they'd trade hostages, the next they'd burn each other's villages, only to shake hands again when it suited them. Olaf understood that power wasn't just taken, it was negotiated, often over a shared cup of wine in the shadow of looming betrayal. Yet for all his political cunning, he never let enemies forget his teeth. The annals of Ulster tell of his raid on Armagh in the year 869, where he spared the monastery's sacred relics but emptied its coffers, a calculated move that left him wealthy without inciting full-scale rebellion. Even his nickname, the White, hints at contradictions. Some say it referred to his fair hair, others claim it symbolized his uncanny ability to appear both conqueror and peacemaker, depending on the audience. Olaf's legacy lingers not in sagas but in the DNA of Dublin itself. The city's Norse-Gaelic fusion, its street names, its hybrid art, even its fierce independence bears his invisible stamp. Because Olaf the White didn't just rule a kingdom, He proved that the deadliest Vikings weren't always the ones who left the most ruins. Sometimes they were the ones who built something that outlasted them. And in Dublin's case, that something still stands today, a silent testament to a king who knew when to raid, when to reign, and when to vanish into legend. Ragnar Lothbrok didn't just march across Britain, he scarred it. Where other Viking warlords played the long game of politics, Ragnar operated like a force of nature, his campaigns less about conquest and more about total erasure. When he descended on Northumbria in the early 10th century, he didn't bother with sieges or negotiations. Towns weren't just raided, they were methodically dismantled, their very foundations salted with terror. Chroniclers of the time wrote of entire regions abandoned at the mere rumor of his approach, fields left untilled and roads eerily silent. His rise to the throne of York wasn't a coronation. It was a coronation by carnage, a kingdom claimed not through lineage but through the sheer weight of spilled blood. Yet what's chilling about Ragnar isn't just the violence, it's the precision. He didn't waste energy on frivolous raids. Every strike had purpose. Monasteries stripped of wealth to fund his wars, rival strongholds burned to eliminate future threats, and captives paraded as living trophies to break the spirit of those still resisting. His reign in York, though brief, was a masterclass in psychological domination. The city's mint even issued coins bearing his name, a blunt declaration that Norse rule wasn't just temporary, it was the new order. But like so many Viking flames, Ragnar burned too fiercely to last. His death in the year 921 left York not with a successor but with chaos. The power vacuum he created became a feeding frenzy for Scots, Saxons, and remaining Norse warlords, all clawing for the throne he'd held through iron will. And that's the paradox of Ragnar Lothbrok. He didn't build an empire or craft a dynasty. His legacy was simpler, darker, a proof of concept that in the right hands, fear could rewrite maps faster than diplomacy ever could. Centuries later, his name still lingers in the margins of history, not as a king who ruled long, but as a storm that reminded Britain just how fragile its borders truly were. Swain didn't just live in the twilight of the Viking Age, he dragged its spirit kicking and screaming into a world that had moved on. While kingdoms built castles and knights swore feudal oaths, Swain remained a relic of an older, wilder era, a man who farmed in winter and raided in summer as if the tides of history hadn't turned. The Orkneyinga saga paints him as a force of nature, his life a defiant middle finger to the notion that Vikings belonged only to the past. Picture this, a grizzled warrior launching a one-man raid on the Hebrides, not with an army at his back, but with a handful of loyal crewmen and a personal grudge. He didn't just attack her, he made it theatrical, like a man reenacting the sagas of old for an audience that had forgotten their lines. What set Swain apart wasn't just his timing, it was his adaptability. When the Earl of Orkney tried to rein him in, Swain didn't resist. He played along, bending the rules until they snapped. He'd swear oaths of loyalty with one breath and plot his next raid with the other, treating politics like a game where the only rule was to win. His most infamous stunt, ambushing an enemy chieftain during Yule celebrations, not for territory or treasure, but because the man had slighted his honor. That was Swain's code. Personal pride mattered more than crowns or treaties. Yet for all his lawlessness, he wasn't a mindless brute. Swain understood the power of reputation. After one brutal skirmish, he sailed straight to the Earl's Hall, still bloodied, and demanded judgment, knowing full well his exploits had already become legend. The Earl, caught between outrage and awe, could only laugh and pardon him. That was Swain's genius. He turned recklessness into a strategy, making men too charmed or too terrified to punish him. Even his death was pure Viking theatre. Old and grey but still untamed, he led a reckless charge against Dublin's Norse Gaelic defenders, refusing to let age dull his edge. The sagas claim he fell with a sword in hand. his last act a fitting end for a man who'd spent his life refusing to bow to kings, to change, or to time itself. Swain proved something extraordinary, that the Viking spirit didn't die with the last longship. It simply found new hosts, men who'd rather burn out than fade away. And in that, he wasn't just a relic, he was the last true echo of an era that refused to be silent. Bjorn the Strong didn't just rebel against his uncle, he waged war against destiny itself. Born into royalty yet denied the Swedish throne, he could have lived a life of quiet resentment. Instead, he chose a path that would etch his name into legend. Picture a warrior so mighty that sagas claimed he could lift boulders meant for 4 men, his strength bending the limits of mortal flesh. But what truly set Bjorn apart wasn't his muscle, it was his refusal to accept the hand fate dealt him. When his uncle Erik the Victorious seized power, Bjorn didn't bow or scheme in shadows. He raised an army of outcasts and exiles, men with nothing to lose, and marched on Uppsala like a storm made flesh. The battle that followed wasn't just a clash of steel, it was myth in motion. Outnumbered and outmaneuvered, Bjorn fought with the fury of a man who knew his name would outlast his life. Chroniclers wrote of him carving through enemy lines like a ship through waves, his axe singing a hymn of defiance. Even as the tides turned against him, he refused retreat, his final stand becoming the stuff of skaldic poetry. Some say he fell to treachery, others claim the gods themselves intervened to tip the scales. But here's the twist, Bjorn's defeat cemented his legacy more than any victory could. In an age where kings were measured by conquests, he proved that glory wasn't just about winning, it was about daring so audaciously that even failure couldn't diminish your name. The sagas remember him not as a cautionary tale but as a symbol. Where Erik the Victorious ruled a kingdom, Bjorn claimed something far more enduring, a story. Centuries later, his rebellion still resonates, a reminder that the Viking spirit wasn't just about power or plunder. It was about the courage to stare down the impossible and laugh, even as the world crumbled around you. And in that, Bjorn the Strong didn't just lose a crown, he became immortal. From Ragnar Lothbrok's shadow stretching across Europe to Bjorn the Strong's thunderous final stand, these 20 chieftains didn't just live history, they bent it to their will. Think about that for a moment. In an era without modern weapons or mass communication, they carved empires with nothing but longships, axes, and a refusal to accept the world as it was. But here's what's truly fascinating. Their legacies aren't measured solely in battles won or gold hoarded. It's in the way they mastered fear as a tool, turned chaos into strategy, and understood that reputation could be sharper than any blade. Take Harald Hardrada's near conquest of England or Rollo's transformation from raider to dynasty founder. These weren't just violent men. They were visionaries who grasped a truth many rulers never learn. Power isn't just taken, it's staged. Every burned monastery, every whispered rumor, every alliance forged and betrayed was part of a grander performance, one that echoed far beyond their lifetimes. Even the outliers like Aud the Deep-Minded or Thorkel the Tall proved there was no single path to influence. Whether through poetry, politics, or pure unpredictability, each of these figures rewrote the rules of their world. So what's left for us centuries later, sifting through their sagas? Not just admiration or horror, though there's plenty of both, but a reminder that leadership wears countless faces. Some of these chieftains built kingdoms that lasted generations, others burned brightly and vanished. What unites them isn't their methods or morals, but that unshakable defiance, the refusal to fade quietly into the dark. That's why we still say their names, not because they were heroes or monsters, but because they were utterly, unforgettably human, flaws and all. Now it's your turn. Which of these Viking warlords left you speechless? Was it Ivar's chilling intellect, Erik Bloodaxe's unrestrained fury, or perhaps Guthrum's masterful reinvention? Let the debates begin in the comments below, and if you're hungry for more tales of history's most formidable figures, don't forget to hit subscribe. We've only scratched the surface.